Hey, listeners, welcome back to the podcast. I'm the host, Sean Boyce. And today, what I want to talk about more is what I refer to as the growth trap, which a lot of professional services firms find themselves falling into when they're attempting to scale beyond where they've had success previously. Now, I talk a lot about product, talk a lot about service, and there are pros and cons to scaling each. It's a little bit more difficult to get a product business off the ground, not so much on the service business side. However, product businesses typically scale more effectively than service-based businesses do. So the growth trap in this case, and what I want to talk about with you today, is something that I think disproportionately affects these professional services businesses that are looking to grow. So I want to talk more about what it is so that you can identify it and then learn a little bit more about what you can do to avoid it to ensure that your professional services business is able to effectively grow and scale. Okay, so first and foremost, what is the growth trap? What do I mean by that? Well, as I've mentioned, I'm talking specifically to those that operate professional services businesses. What typically happens is you go through a few different stages of growth. And on the earlier side, what they're intending to do with their company is establish themselves as a brand, understand that their value proposition has enough value to successfully build a successful business around, and then get to a certain level of performance. The growth trap in this case that affects these professional services firms typically happens around that $10 to $20 million in annual revenue range level of performance for these companies. And at that range, they might have decent size to their company in the 50 to upwards of 100 employee range at that point. Now, when they get here, one of the scary elements about that, and if you've talked to any business owners or partners at firms like that, what they fear is getting stuck there. What they're trying to do is get over that hurdle as quickly as possible because there's a lot of professional services firms that don't make it past that level. So as such, getting stuck there is a scary proposition because of also what happens to a lot of firms that do, inevitably get stuck there. Their level of performance as they were on this kind of like rocket ship in terms of growth for what they're used to, at least, that starts to slow down. At some point, it starts to reverse itself. A lot of the people that run the organization are somewhat unsure why. And then what happens from there is as the performance starts to deteriorate, they become ripe for acquisition, which, if they're unable to catch it soon enough, becomes kind of a forced choice situation where they almost have to sell. And nobody ever wants to be in a situation like that. So that's why this element is so scary. So let's talk a little bit more about the details of the growth trap, but why so many firms kind of fall into it. That's what I want to kind of get into next. So the reason why a lot of firms fail to scale beyond this level of that like $10 to $20 million annual revenue range is because, in my opinion, from what I've studied, they expect the strategies and the processes that they've built and leveraged to get them to that level, to carry them past that level and to a significantly higher level of growth as well. And that doesn't work. You need to take a different approach, a different strategy in order to enable your firm to kind of reach that next level. So I'll use an analogy to explain it. The example I'd use is like, if you guys are familiar with racing at all, there's a bunch of different classes depending on the type of race you may be talking about. So there's upwards of including like professional kart racing, which you may have seen before. Looks like the typical go-kart you might see like a kid using and having fun with, but they're professionals that drive these types of vehicles. And then all the way on the other extreme, you've got like Formula One races, which are some of the most expensive, fastest race cars available in the world. If you are successful in that lower class of karting, like professional karting, for example, you can't take that car and have success in Formula One with that. You're going to be embarrassed, essentially. But, so using that vehicle in the different racing class could mean great success, or it could mean basically being completely embarrassed off the track, like laughed off the track. As such, what you need to do is you need to make significant upgrades to your capabilities and the sophistication that you have available in order to compete at the next level. So in order to do that, you need to evaluate, what type of upgrade you need to make. And this is a similar pattern that happens at these professional services firms. Problem is, a lot of them don't see it before it's too late. And as such, their performance starts to dip. And if they become, too frustrated with this process or they can't figure it out, they become ripe for acquisition. And a lot of firms get acquired in this way, or at this point, this kind of phase of their company's life cycle. So, the companies become somewhat desperate and they feel like they've kind of run out of options. So, I want to compare and contrast that next to what, healthy growth trajectory looks like so that you can know for your firm. So healthy trajectory comes in phases, healthy growth trajectory for your professional services firm. On the earlier side, you are building and selling, right? You're testing the critical foundational elements to your business, which includes branding, positioning, the strength of your value proposition, all of these things. But once you've established that and you're securing consistent wins with clients, you're starting to get referrals, the intensity of your growth is increasing, then it becomes an element of figuring out how you sustain that growth. So as that growth trajectory begins, firms look to expand their capabilities to help themselves grow. So they make investments in areas like business development, sales, marketing. Then once these investments start to pay off and have the desired effect, the revenue starts to grow, and it starts to grow considerably. You're talking about like double-digit, sometimes multiple double-digit percentage growth year over year in the earlier phases of this intense growth trajectory. So as that revenue grows, where that's coming from is you're landing more business. For example, you might be, a CPA firm, accounting firm, for example. If you've sold and booked more engagements of different types, that means the demand for your service delivery is now going to increase significantly as well. So you've got to do something to deal with that influx. And that's where one of the bigger mistakes starts to happen on the earlier side of things, which will inevitably slow down your growth if you haven't made upgrades in your service delivery, because the demand, that increase in demand for your services on your service delivery department can really slow down your efforts to be able to grow, because it becomes the bottleneck in your process, and as such, they can't handle that increase in demand and that growth at that rate because you haven't made the proper investments in order to make sure that they can handle it. So what you need to do is you need to, be able to build that to scale, and you need to do that when the timing is right, because you've made these investments in growth. And then once that wave of demand arrives and hits your service delivery department, they need to be ready in order to have what they need in order to be able to support that growth, which will also enable you to protect your profitability as well also. I want to share with you kind of a telltale sign and a trap beyond the growth trap here, just a smaller trap, if you will, related to the growth trap. And it's focusing on certain metrics. A lot of professional services firms, like CPA firms, for example, they will focus on growth related to revenue, which is something, it's obviously, a metric. In terms of it being the most important metric, that's where I question it. Because if your revenue is growing at the same level that your expenses, have you really made any progress? Because your firm has become more profitable. So I would put revenue more in the category of a vanity metric. I know it's what the industry uses to measure everything, but what you really need to keep your eye on is profit. Because if your revenue is going up at the same pace of your expenses, then your profit hasn't budged and your operations only grown more complex. What you should be looking at is how effectively you are able to grow your profit. That's kind of the main objective here. And as such, that's why we're going to talk a little bit more about improving your operational efficiency, because what should happen in a healthy trajectory is as your revenue grows, so should your profitability, or at least the profitability should not go down. You should be able to grow your profitability in lockstep with your revenue. Now, I'm talking a lot about making these investments. So how do you think about them and when do you make them? So this is where you can manage it related to a timeline. So I would recommend that you keep a closer eye on not just making these investments, but when you need to make them so that they can help propel you through the next phase of growth. So in order to be able to know how to do that, you're going to need to know not just that your firm is expected to grow, but when it's expected to grow. So the majority of the focus through the growth phase is on expanding, business development and sales operations. And that makes sense because the focus is growth. However, like I've mentioned already, you need to be considering how you're going to improve your operational efficiency throughout this phase for the aforementioned reasons in terms of how that can ultimately slow you down and become the bottleneck in your process. So most firms are aware that they need to make these investments, but the common solution for this, or what they think is the common solution for this, is to just throw bodies at it, as in you can continue to just hire people and meet that demand as they expand their team. That is a recipe for failure and can cause major problems at a later stage because your process that you used at an earlier stage of growth is not necessarily going to be able to handle that capacity, even if you just add people to it, right? It may have been inefficient then, and now you're talking about increasing it by, say, 200 to 400%, and it's going to become a bottleneck and a step in your process ultimately that breaks, basically shutting down your assembly line, which is like stopping the presses at a newspaper factory. That is something to avoid at all costs. So what you need to do instead is focus on improving your capacity and operational efficiency as you grow. And that's why it's so important in order to know kind of when you need to make these investments. So making them on the earlier side and ensuring that they're going to be ready for this new wave of activity when it arrives is going to benefit your firm significantly because it won't slow down your growth. If anything, it will accelerate it. And that's why I want you to think about this sooner rather than later. Now, if you, on the other hand, wait until the growth arrives in order to make these investments, chances are that could be too late. Your firm is likely to reverse course at that point because the bottlenecks will have to start to overcome your ability to grow. You won't be able to turn around, new client engagements. You won't be able to meet the service delivery demand. And that's what ultimately kind of starts this chain reaction of negative effects due to the growth and your lack of an ability to kind of meet that, which ultimately affects your firm's performance. So I want to summarize what you can do in order to avoid this trap for your professional services firm. What you need to do is you need to know essentially when you need to make the improvements in your operational efficiency along the timeline of when you plan to grow so that you can match that in lockstep. More specifically, in terms of where you need to make these upgrades, I want you to focus on the area between client acceptance, where you're signing up new clients, and service delivery, where you're turning around essentially what these clients need and why they signed on with your firm. So that's where you're going to need to ultimately improve. I've written other articles that go into more detail about this specific topic in terms of some of the tactical things that you can do in order to be prepared to plan to grow your professional services firm more effectively. I'll link to that in the show notes for this episode so you can check that out. So look through where you can make those investments. Look to plan it out so that you can know along what timeline making these investments makes the most sense. And then plan to make those while you are making these investments in growth. So investments in business development, marketing, sales. As you are planning those investments, understand that shortly thereafter, and along a similar timeline, you're going to need to make these improvements in operational efficiency so that you can meet this coming wave of demand so that it doesn't slow down progress for your firm. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you got value out of the episode. I help professional services firms like yours grow your profitability, ideally exponentially, and maintain that aggressive growth trajectory without needing to add significant headcount. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about what I can do to help you there, feel free to email me, Sean at NxtStep.io. That's Sean, SEAN at NxtStep, NxtStep.io. And consider joining my free daily mailing list where I talk more about strategic advice like this on a daily basis. Thanks, guys. Talk soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Product Launch. I hope you got value out of it. I like to feature product people on my podcast because that's who I love to help. I'm a product strategist, and I can help you scale your business and grow your profit through a product. If you'd like to learn more about how I can help you, email me at Sean at NxtStep.io. That's Sean, SEAN, at NxtStep, NxtStep.io. Or visit my website at NxtStep.io. That's NxtStep.io.